In this set of mini lectures, we're going to discuss root, leaf, and other types of cuttings. Now, root cuttings are different from stem cuttings in that stem cuttings only have to produce new roots. A root cutting, on the other hand, has to produce both new shoots and new roots. So if you'll see in the picture here, you can see the original root piece, which is brown and horizontal, and it has produced both adventitious shoots and adventitious roots. Now, that original root piece is not going to become part of the new plant. It's eventually, once it produces an entire new plantlet with new shoots and roots, it's going to decay and disappear. Now, on a root cutting, our shoots will originate more easily than roots. So you're going to get shoots first and then adventitious roots, which means you have to be really careful once it gets that new shoot not to let it dry out. Because at that point we do have leaves that are transpiring, but no roots to take up more water. Now, the best time of year to take root cuttings is in winter, and that's because that's the time of year when there's the most stored carbohydrates in the roots. During the spring and summer, when the plant is putting on new shoot growth, it's using up all those carbohydrate energy stores for new shoots, new stems and leaves, and even flowers and fruits. But in the winter, when the plant goes dormant, all the carbohydrates are stored down in the roots, which means we have lots of sugars and energies there to be used to produce a new plant via root cuttings. This diagram shows you how to take a root cutting. Now, the best way to take a root cutting is to take it from a plant that's growing in a container. That way, all you have to do is pull it out of the container and snip off a root. However, you can take root cuttings of plants that are growing outside, but when you do that, you want to do what they're doing in the left side of the picture here. You want to move out away from the plant a bit to the edge of the root ball and take your root cuttings from the tips of the roots. There's two reasons you want to do this. First, because if you cut too close to the plant itself, you're going to be cutting off some large major roots, and that can damage the plant. The other reason is that the tips of the roots are actively growing. They're the most actively growing portion of the roots. So if you guys remember back to the plant anatomy lectures, we talked about apical meristems, which are growing points. Well, apical meristems are found at the tips of branches, and they're also found at the tips of roots. So that's why it's better to try to come out to some of the smaller roots at the tips of the root ball for your root cuttings. Now, the size of the cuttings will vary, and I'll talk a little more about that later. This diagram recommends 3 inches. And you'll see that here they're laying the cuttings horizontally in media and covering them up. That is fine to do if you're propagating a species in which polarity is not that important. However, for most woody plants, polarity in root cuttings is going to be important. So you won't be able to just lay your cuttings horizontally like that. You'll want to stick them vertically with the proximal end facing up and the distal end facing down. Because remember, root cuttings have polarity that is the opposite of stem cuttings. On a root cutting, the proximal end, which is closest to the crown, will produce shoots, and the distal end, most distant from the crown, will produce roots. In a stem cutting, it's the opposite. The proximal end produces roots and the distal end produces shoots. So, when you take your root cutting, you'll probably want to cut one end straight and the other slanted so that you won't forget which is the proximal end and which is the distal end when you go to stick your cutting. This is a cross-section of a woody root. Roots have different structure than stems, and so you'll also notice that there are the numbers 1 and 2 by some of these layers of the cross-section. Anything labeled with a 1 will give rise to adventitious shoots on your root cutting, and any tissue labeled 2 will give rise to adventitious roots. So the phloem, ray, and pericycle will give rise to adventitious shoots, and the pericycle and vascular cambium give rise to adventitious roots. Now, that's a lot of terms I just threw out there, so let me go over them for you briefly. The phloem is also called the cork cambium. They're the same thing, and it's a secondary meristem. Secondary meristems are responsible for growth and girth of the plant, so making it larger around rather than taller or longer. Remember, we discussed the primary or apical meristems. Primary meristems, which includes apical meristems, are going to cause a plant to grow taller or longer. So these are the meristems at the tips of the branches and the roots, and also in the buds. They're making the plant grow taller and longer. Secondary meristems, like the phloem, help increase girth. The phloem is also responsible for producing outer layers of woody plants such as bark layers. So this is only found in woody plants. The next term is ray, and these are those lines that look like spokes on a wheel. Rays are just lines of parenchyma cells. They serve a lot of purposes in plants, but if you'll remember, parenchyma cells are fairly undifferentiated, so they're good for propagation purposes, and so it makes sense that our adventitious shoots would arise from those undifferentiated parenchyma cells in the ray. The pericycle is the only one of these tissues that can give rise both to adventitious shoots and roots. It's bordered internally by phloem and externally by outer layers of bark. And then finally we have the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium is also a secondary meristem, just like the phloem. So it's again causing the plant to grow in girth. And we'll talk a lot more about it later when we get to grafting. But it does produce xylem and phloem, and in a root cutting it will give rise to adventitious roots. Now, this is where our adventitious shoots and roots come from in a root cutting. However, sometimes a root cutting will just produce a massive callus, and the shoots and roots will come from those callus cells as well. So now we'll talk about the different sizes and types of root cuttings. For small, delicate roots of herbaceous plants, you only need a piece about 1 to 2 inches long, and these are the ones that you can lay horizontally on your media. So you can do what they're doing in the picture here, lay it on the media, cover it over with about 1/2 inch more media, and then just let them do their thing. You do need to keep the soil moist in this scenario, but not really wet or they will rot. And in fact, in the classes I teach in person, we have a lot more success by propagating these type of root cuttings in a Ziploc bag full of slightly moistened perlite, vermiculite, or sand. And when I say slightly moistened, I'm talking about 1 part water to around 14 to 16 parts perlite, vermiculite, or sand. So it's not very wet at all. Otherwise, they're going to rot because they're in a damp environment, and you're also storing these in a heated environment, by which I just mean room temperature, not outside in the middle of winter. Fleshy roots, these can be on herbaceous or woody plants, but we want them to be 2 to 3 inches long, and these typically work better than small, delicate roots. The problem with small, delicate roots is they don't have a lot of energy stored up in them because they're so small, and so they're not typically all that successful. However, fleshy roots work quite well. This is what I use for my in-person classes, and again, we stick ours in a Ziploc bag with perlite or vermiculite that's been slightly moistened because they can be horizontal there because the plant we use is herbaceous. However, if you're taking this off a woody plant, it's more possible that polarity is going to be an issue, and so in this case, you want to stick it in some sort of media, just like the media you used for your stem cuttings, and stick it vertically, making sure to maintain proper polarity with the proximal end facing up and the distal end facing down. And then finally we have the large out-of-door roots. I put this picture here because they're large out-of-door roots that are easy to see, but actually these roots in the picture are too large. You wouldn't want to cut those off for a root cutting because that tissue is too old, it's not going to work very well, and you could probably damage that tree taking off a root that big. So again, you're going to move out to the tips of the root ball. You're going to take your large out-of-door root cuttings, and these will be a little longer, 2 to 6 inches long. Now, whereas the small delicate roots and the fleshy roots you would keep indoors at room temperature or slightly warmer than that, large out-of-door roots can be stored at pretty cold temperatures, particularly if you think about the fact that they've already been growing in those temperatures. If you're taking this in winter, you're going to store them at around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You wouldn't want it to be much colder than that. So that's where having a cloche or a cold frame would be useful. And you store them there for 3 weeks. And you're going to store them by sticking them vertically, fairly deep in the media. You really only need the very tip of your cuttings to be poking out of the media, so maybe like 1/2 inch. What often happens then, if you're taking these near the end of the winter and then you wait 3 weeks, it's going to be spring. So what will happen is you get those adventitious shoots forming first, and then you can either just leave it and wait for the adventitious roots to form, or you can cut those shoots off and treat them as a softwood stem cutting. And it's been found that sometimes when you do this, Those adventitious shoots from the root cutting will root a lot quicker than a conventional softwood stemwood cutting. So a good option for difficult to root plants that can be propagated by both root and softwood cuttings. Now there are a relatively small number of plants that can be propagated this way, and I've listed some examples here for you. The Stokes acer is an herbaceous plant, and I have it pictured here. It's also a native plant and quite attractive. I'm a big fan of it. We also have the mimosa tree, which you saw on the very first picture in this lecture of a root cutting. That was a mimosa cutting. Perennial phlox, raspberries, and lilacs. Now remember, chimeras cannot be propagated by root cuttings. You can get a new plant by root cuttings of a chimera, but it's not going to have the chimeric mutation. So for example, take our raspberry. We can propagate it by root cuttings, but if you have a thornless raspberry, which are typically chimeras, and I propagate it by root cuttings, I'll get a new raspberry plant, but it won't be thornless. So keep that in mind. And with that, we end our lecture on root cuttings.